I'm glad I split the video into a second part because everything I did in the first part was pretty much self-explanatory. I used astronomical events and retro calculation along with archaeological evidence to show what time period the Israelites entered into Egypt and when they left. Then I showed evidence of slavery during the 13th dynasty of Egypt, and in doing so, we also verified the authenticity of the story of the destruction of Sodom, along with the walls coming down at Jericho and the city being burned. But in this video, I won't be able to show evidence without correcting the Egyptian timeline and Israelite history. I'll briefly explain what has happened. The third intermediate period of Egypt dates from about 1070 BC to 664 BC, about 400 years. This has been greatly exaggerated by at least 200 years. To explain how would take me many videos, as I explained before. David Rowe and Peter James wrote books going into the Egyptian history to explain this, and you should definitely read their work for a full explanation, but I'm going to quickly show you that 300-year discrepancy as directly as I can. At Wadi Hammamat in the schist quarries, we have an engraving of the Canaan genealogy. He carved in stone his genealogy and his fathers going back 22 generations. He did this in year 26 of King Darius, the Persian ruler of Lower and Upper Egypt at the time, who is also mentioned in the Bible. We know that year 26 of Darius is 496 BC. This is a concrete date in history, as are all dates that came after 664 BC. So we'll give every generation in his genealogy an approximation of 21 years and go all the way back through his genealogy 22 generations to Bakken Konsu, which would take us back to approximately 937 BC. We know from other sources that Bakken Konsu was the son of Neferhotep, the vizier of Egypt, who was contemporary with Ramesses II. This would place Ramesses II early reign around 958 BC. In the conventional scheme of dating in Egypt, his early reign is placed around 1279 BC, a 300-year discrepancy. So biblically, this would also place him as a contemporary of King Solomon and Rehoboam. And in turn, when making this adjustment to the Egyptian timeline, Akhenaten would have reigned in 1023 BC, making him a contemporary of Saul and David. The most important thing to remember, and perhaps the hardest to wrap your head around, is that when correcting the Egyptian dates, the time period moved down with the new Egyptian dates. So David and Solomon's kingdom no longer exists within the early Iron Age, their kingdom now exists within the late Bronze Age. This is why they say there is no archaeological evidence to show the kingdom of Israel existed under David or Solomon. They have been looking in the wrong time period. So I'll use the rest of this video to show late Bronze Age evidence of Israel that has been found. I mentioned Akhenaten being a contemporary of Saul. Well, we have a collection of letters written to him from city-state rulers of Canaan requesting troops for helps against the Apiru. The Apiru, or Apiru, as mentioned in my last video, was a derogatory term used for all Hebrews. So Israelites were Apiru, but not all Apiru were Israelites. This is important for understanding the context of the letters that were written to Akhenaten and who they were writing about. These letters were recorded in the Amarna Tablets. If you've heard of these tablets, then you may be aware that these are dated to the 14th century BC. However, I'm proposing that these are all 10th century BC texts, and as you will find out, refer specifically to Saul's Israelite revolt against the Philistine vassal rulers. The city-states mentioned in the tablets were Gaza, Lachish, Ashkelon, Gath, Jerusalem, Gezer, Pella, Tahanak, Megiddo, Akko, and Tyre, with smaller towns being Hebron, Keilah, Aijalon, Manahatu, Shechem, Gath Padella, Gina, Shunem, and Beit Shan, and Seal. Many names I'm sure you recognize from the Bible. The Apiru ruler of this region was Labaya or Labayu. He can be referred to as Eva. the last vowel in his name being a placeholder for whatever god he served. We're going to read the tablets and understand that Labaya is Saul, the first king of Israel. The academic world already recognizes that Saul has an identical history to Labaya. This is Professor Oded Tammuz of Ben Gurion University, Professor Gunnar Lehman, and Professor Israel Finkelstein, to name a few. But however, they probably feel that the Israelites appropriated the story of these Habaru revolutionists that occupied Israel 300 years prior to their arrival. With correct understanding of Egyptian chronology, they would have recognized them as Israelites. In any case, they would agree the Israelite account in the book of Samuel is something the Habaru experienced 300 years earlier. Then we notice with other books in the Bible, 300 years before Joseph was vizier in Egypt, we have a vizier at Anku who set up grain stores in Egypt because of a 7-year famine, because of the 7-year inundation, because of the Nile. Then 300 years before the time of the late Exodus, as some people believe, the Western Semitic people of Avaris had abandoned the city after a plague. Then we come to the time of Joshua's conquest. We find no evidence of him being there because there was no city of Jericho to conquer, as the city walls fell 300 years prior. I think you get the point, but let's get back to the tablets. Labaya's territory and Saul's were identical. They both controlled the central hill country, excluding the Jebus, which is biblically Jerusalem, the hills of Galilee, and the Jordan Valley and Gilead in Transjordan. They did not control the lowland territories of Jezreel, the Sharon Plain, or the coastal plain of Philistia. We'll start with the letter Labaya wrote to Akhenaten in tablet EA 252, which you can find in the British Museum, coincidentally. If ants are smitten, they do not accept the smiting quietly, but bite the hand of the man who smites them. This Benjamite ruler of Israel is threatening an Egyptian pharaoh. This was our first king in the land of Israel. Albright wrote of this tablet that although this king is writing in cuneiform, he is untutored in Akkadian, which was the lingua franca of that time. He noted that he was inexperienced in diplomatic protocols and writes in a dialect of ancient Hebrew. So while the text of the tablet is cuneiform, it's actually Hebrew that we are reading. The name Labaya is actually used to refer to Saul and his men in Psalms chapter 57 and verse 4. This is a psalm of David after he just fled from Saul in the cave. He says, "My soul is among lions." Lions here is the word Labaim, is the plural. "And I lie even among them that are set on fire, even the sons of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword." If we look at the root word used in this passage, it's Labai, meaning lion. And remember I mentioned the vowel on the end of his name was a placeholder for a god. So Labaya could actually just mean Labaya, lion of Yah. Next we'll look at another letter he sent to Akhenaten in tablet EA 254. "Moreover, the king wrote about my son. I did not know that he was consorted with the Habaru. I herewith hand him over to Adiah." This is the Egyptian commissioner. This was in reference to Jonathan siding with David, who had aligned himself with Hebrew mercenaries. I'll read 1 Samuel chapter 20 verses 30 and 31. "Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse," Jesse's son is David, "to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die." What we also know is that Saul and Labaya both died in the same location, losing battles against rulers from identical cities. I'll read the full account of his death, then come back to the tablets for a comparison. I'll start in 1 Samuel chapter 28, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 4. "And it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare, to fight with Israel. And Achish here is the king of Gath, he's known in the tablets as Shuar-Data, which is a Indo-European name. And the Achish said unto David, Know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. And David said to Achish, Surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. And Achish said to David, Therefore will I make thee the keeper of mine head forever. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him, and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. And the Philistines gathered themselves together, and came and pitched in Shunem, this is near Jezreel. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. Gilboa was the place of his death. Now I'm going to read from verse 1 of the next chapter. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed on by in the hundreds and by thousands, but David and his men passed on in the rearward, that's at the back, with Achish. Then said the princes of the Philistines, so these are the leaders of the other city towns, What do these Hebrews here? And Achish said unto the princes of the Philistines, Is not this David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, which have been with me these days, all these years, and I have found no fault in him since he fell unto me this day? And the princes of the Philistines were wroth with him. And the princes of the Philistines said unto him, Make this fellow return, that he may go again to his place which thou hast appointed him, and let him not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us. For wherewith should he reconcile himself unto his master? Should it not be with the heads of these men? Is not this David, of whom they sang one another in dances, saying, Saul slew thousands, and David his 10,000s? Then Achish called unto David, and said unto him, Surely, as the Lord liveth, thou hast been upright, and thy going out and thy coming in with me in the whole host is good in my sight. For I have found not evil in thee since the days of thy coming unto me unto this day. Nevertheless, the Lord's favour thee not. Wherefore now return, and go in peace, that thou displease not the lords of the Philistines. So they refused to let David go down with them, because they thought that David would betray them in the fight against Saul. Now I'm going to read chapter 31. This is Saul's death, from the first verse. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then Saul said unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through, and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword, and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword, and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men that same day together. So Saul died with 3 of his men in Mount Gilboa. So now let's see these events play out through the Amarna Tablets. First we have a letter from Beridia. He was ruler at Megiddo at the time, close to Gilboa where Labiah was, in tablet EA 245. Moreover, I urge my brothers, if the God of the King, our Lord, brings it about that we overcome Labiah, then we must bring him alive to the King, our Lord. But my mare was brought down, and so I took my place behind Yashdata. Yashdata was the ruler of Taanach, and rode with him. However, before my arrival, they had slain him. So Beridia is saying that Labiah was killed in Gilboa before they could bring him to Egypt. We know from the biblical account Saul took his own life, but here Beridia credits Achish or Shuar-Data with killing him, as Achish did himself in EA 366. Let the king, my lord, be informed that the Apiru, this is singular, so he's talking about one man, who was raised up against the lands, the God of the king, my lord, delivered him to me, and I have smitten him. There are other tablets that go into what transpired at the battle in Gilboa that help us to understand the biblical biblical account with better understanding as well. But I want to show a tablet from Ishbal, Saul's surviving son, who became ruler after he died. I'll just get 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 10. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and reigned 2 years, but the house of Judah followed David. Ishbosheth means man of shame. Ish means man and Bosheth is shame. The scribes didn't want to refer to him by his actual name, which you can find in 1 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 33. And Ner begat Kish, and Kish begat Saul, and Saul begat Jonathan, Malchishua, and Abinadab, and Ishbal. So here we have Ishbal, man of Baal, which is why they wouldn't give his correct name in the book of Samuel. He worshipped other gods. In the Amarna Tablets, Lobiah's son is named Mutbal, which is the Canaanite translation of man of Baal. Another coincidence if these are not the same people. Mutbal's letters pharaoh was most revealing of them all in EA 256. How can it be said in your presence, Mutbal has fled? He has hidden Ayab. As the king my lord lives, I swear, Ayab is not in Pella. In fact, he has been in the field, which is at war, for 2 months. Just ask Benanima. Just ask Dadua. Just ask Yeshua. Mutbal is being accused of hiding Ayab, and he's denied this, saying that Benanima, Dadua, and Yeshua can vouch for him. We can biblically identify everyone in this message. Ayab translates to Joab, who was David's general. Benanima translates to Baana, who was one of Ishbal's captains. Dadua translates to David, and Yeshua translates to Jesse, who, as we know, was David's father. This cannot be coincidental. The Amarna Tablets are referring to biblical figures that we are told never existed. But just to be sure though, why would the pharaoh of Egypt, who was either Akhenaten or Tutankhamun at this time, be more interested in Joab than David or Ishbal, especially within the context of what just happened with Lobiah? Well, the Bible actually fills in this gap. If we look at the book of 1 Kings chapter 11, and I'm going to read verses 15 to 20. For it came to pass, when David was in Edom, and Joab, the captain of the host, was gone up to bury the slain, after he had smitten every male in Edom. For 6 months did Joab remain there with all Israel, until he had cut off every male in Edom. That Hadad fled, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him, to go into Egypt, Hadad being yet a little child. And they arose out of Midian and came to Paran, and they took men with them out of Paran, and they came to Egypt, unto Pharaoh king of Egypt, which gave him an house, and appointed him victuals, and gave him land. And Hadad found great favour in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he gave him to wife the sister of his own wife, the sister of Tapenes, the queen. And the sister of Tapenes bare him Genubath his son, whom Tapenes weaned in Pharaoh's house, and Genubath was in Pharaoh's household among the sons of Pharaoh. So Akhenaten, or maybe Tutankhamun, had an Edomite brother-in-law that wanted revenge for what Joab had did to the Edomites. This is why I hinted in part 1 that I had an idea of who the Asiatic settlers were that arrived at Stratum F in Avaris. Edomites may have had ties to Egypt going back as far as the 14th dynasty. These are not the only synchronicities we notice with the Amarna Tablets and the Bible. During King David's reign, he came up against Hadadezer, which we can read about in 2 Samuel chapter 8 verses 3 to 8. David smote also Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, and he went to recover his border at the river Euphrates. And David took from him 1,000 chariots, and 700 horsemen, and 20,000 footmen. And David held all the chariot horses, but reserved of them for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to succor Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David slew of the Syrians 22,000 men. Then David put garrisons in Syria and Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought gifts, and the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. And David took the shields of gold that were on the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Beth-Raphi, the cities of Hadadezer, King David took exceeding much brass. We can now identify Hadadezer as Apiru, the son of Abdiashirta, mentioned in the tablets. The political expansion of the states of Apiru is identical to that of the biblical Aram Zobah. Apiru is a shortening of a more formal name, with the final vowel being a placeholder for a god, just as with Labayu. So if we add the Syrian weather god to Apiru's name, we get Hadadezer, meaning Hadad is the helper. So the United Monarchy period, which we had no evidence for in the Iron Age, we can now find plenty of evidence for when we shift Egyptian dating downward, bringing the Late Bronze Age into that United Monarchy period. I could go on to show more Late Bronze Age evidence of Solomon's kingdom, or evidence that David took part in the Battle of Kadesh, for example, but I think this is a good place to end the video. Over these two videos, we've proved the Bible is given an account of actual historical events going back as far as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe in the future I'll give Abraham's account and reveal who the kings of Genesis 14 were. I know some people have a hard time identifying them, but now that I've done these videos proving the existence of Israelites in history, showing the biblical accounts to be true, I'll now do a third part proving that the Israelites were not the Shasu, and that the Most High's name is not Yahu or Yahu, as I've heard some people say. All praises to the Most High.